Welcome back in, everybody. Hope you're doing well. It's still the 21 off season. It's still the Kansas City Chiefs. We've been away for a few weeks on a couple of vacations and then working and paying the bills and things like that. I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great summer. We are just about 6-7 weeks away from the start of the football season, and I'm already excited for it. I know you guys are too. So today, though, we're going to be talking about the defensive line, and we're still talking about the Kansas City Chiefs, and we're going to talk about Chris Jones. We're going to talk about defensive end, and we're going to talk about the depth, and we're going to talk about everything that we can possibly think of. We have numbers all over the place. It's going to be messy, chaotic, but we are going to get in detail and talk about what really needs to happen or what the outlook is for Kansas City on the defensive line for 2021. I've got the fan going today, so if that creates a little bit of background noise, I apologize, but it's about 95 degrees outside, and I need to keep my studio just a little bit cool so I can think straight. Thank you for joining us today. Let's start going through all of these numbers, and like I said, it's going to be a little bit messy, but we will work our way through it. This number right here, this is where we start at, 4,800. That's about how many snaps an NFL team has each season at defensive line if you have 4 defensive linemen, okay? So 4 linemen on every play, about 1,200 snaps per defensive lineman. That produces about 4,800 snaps. Now that number goes up and down for each team and each season. It's not a consistent number, but that's a good place to start. And basically that's how many snaps are available for all of these guys to play for Kansas City this year. And the idea is this: if I know who I've got on my team, it's my job to figure out before the season even starts who I want playing the most and at what positions. Now, this is just a map. It's going to change all through the season. I mean, it's going to change with the first injury. It's going to change with the second and third injury. It's going to change when one player starts outplaying their expectations. It's going to change from one week to the next with an opponent and the matchups. It's going to change with the weather. It's going to change if another player kind of is disappointing and not doing very well. So this is really just the first of about 12 different renditions that we'll see throughout the season, but you have to start somewhere. So this is just a crude start. 4,800 snaps is how much is available. Now, this section right here is the number of snaps that I personally, not Kansas City, I'm not pretending to know what they're going to do or what Andy Reid thinks, and I'm not trying to predict what Kansas City is going to do this year. I'm kind of bad at predictions, so I don't do as much of it as I used to. This is in an ideal world, just based on talent, the number of snaps that I would give to each player until somebody got injured, okay? And I would start off right here with Chris Jones. I think far and away, he's your best defensive lineman. I don't think there's much question about that, especially when we're talking about getting to the quarterback. There is nobody else on the entire Chiefs roster and only a handful of other players in the NFL who can get to the quarterback as consistently and as often as Chris Jones. And he would get there even more often, except for the fact that he's also one of the few players in the NFL who commands as many double teams and even occasional triple teams as he does. And those double and triple teams keep his numbers down a lot from where he would be if he were only playing single coverage every single week. But about 900 snaps. You might ask, why not 1,200 snaps? You said about 4 players, 1,200 snaps per position. Well, in the NFL, they rotate people so much on the defensive line, and really in college too, that very few defensive linemen ever get above 1,000 snaps. They try to keep them fresh. They try to rotate them in and out. Offensive linemen, very often you'll see them get 1,100 snaps, 1,200 snaps in a single season. Cornerbacks, defensive backs, a lot of times you'll see them get 1,100, 1,200 snaps in a season. Same thing for the quarterbacks. Not unusual to see them get way over 1,000 snaps. But for defensive linemen, you don't usually see too many people getting up above 1,000 snaps. So for Chris Jones, in an ideal world, if I'm trying to keep him fresh, excuse me just a second, if I'm trying to keep him fresh, and if I'm trying to make sure that he doesn't wear out and get run down before the playoffs start, 900 snaps is about where I want to be with Chris Jones. Same thing for Jarran Reed. I don't think Reed is anywhere near the player that Jones is, but Jones is consistent. He can get just a lot of pressure, even though he's rarely the first guy to the quarterback. We saw this in Seattle. He is almost never the first guy to the quarterback as a pass rusher, but he just gets so much pressure and he demands double teams. and so with his ability to move over to defensive end some, he's going to get a lot of snaps as well. So in an ideal world, I would give 900 snaps to Jaron Reed as well. I think they're your two best players. Moving over to the second cluster, second tier of players right here, Frank Clark, Derek Nottingham, and I'm going to call him Travell. It's Treshawn Wharton. I apologize. These three guys, I think, is your next group of defensive linemen. Clark, even though I'm not going to try to start a big controversy again with Frank Clark, I do not think that he's playing up to his contract, his salary, his trade that they did for him a couple of seasons ago. I do think he's going to be gone during the next offseason. I think it was particularly telling that they didn't restructure him. Of all the other players that they didn't restructure Frank Clark, at least not yet this offseason, up to the point of me making this video. There's a lot of good things that Frank Clark still does. All right, he's relentless on the outside edge. If the quarterback gets flushed out of the pocket over to Frank Clark's side, Frank Clark is always there to make that play. Frank Clark is solid against the run. I like having Frank Clark there. I don't really think, based on the people I'm reading after, I don't really think that he's going to disappear in October for legal reasons. I think he's going to continue playing. I also don't think, and I'm not sure, again, this is a prediction, I don't think the NFL is going to come down to the hammer right now on Frank Clark, but we'll see. This is assuming that if Frank Clark gets to play the whole season, and I'm kind of assuming that he will, Frank Clark, I would give him about 750 snaps, something like that. Same thing for Wharton. I really like Wharton. I think Wharton has a lot of upside. He really came on last year out of nowhere for me. I did not see him coming like a Mack truck. Really impressive player. Could he be a lot better? I think so. Could he take a step back? Yeah, we've seen that before. We've seen guys have really impressive first years, and we've seen them take a step back. But I do like Wharton. I think I would love to see him get 700 snaps, 750 snaps, something like that. Derek Nottingham. Nottingham right now is a major disruption in the running game, all right? He's not elite, but he's a major disruptor in the running game, and I would love to see him get 500 snaps this year on the defensive line. If he can, I think I covered this in an earlier video, if Nottingham can figure out a way to get pressure on the quarterback this year, he's never done it. In 3 seasons now, he's never been good at getting pressure on the quarterback. But if he can figure out a way to do that some this year, develop at least 1 or 2 moves to get to the quarterback, he stands to make a lot of money in 2021 because he's already significantly above average, a major disruptor in the running game for the defensive line. So that's your next cluster. And then the rest of the guys, basically, in an ideal world, would be sharing about 1,000 snaps. And that's between Okafor, Saunders, Carlton, Kando, and Michael Dana, as well as Tim Ward, didn't put on the board. Here's the problem. This isn't an ideal world. Okay, this isn't reality. The reality is this. Out of these 5 guys right here, 4 of them are defensive tackles. And that means that out of your 5 best players, what I view as your 5 best players on the defensive line, and most of you in Kansas City already know this, you're already well aware of this, we've talked about this all offseason. Out of those 5 best players, 4 of them play defensive tackle, and only 1 of them is defensive end, which means either one of these fellas needs to move over and get some major time at defensive tackle, or you're just going to have a little bit of a deficit at defensive end, okay, one or the other. They are loaded at defensive tackle. They have guys who can stop the run. They have guys who can get pressure on the quarterback. They have guys who demand double teams. They have guys who are big. They have guys who are little. They have guys who are experienced. They have guys who are young. You have basically everything you could possibly want at defensive tackle. It's very impressive. And then at defensive end, it's not quite so impressive. So my ideal world is not going to quite work out. And that brings us up here to reality, okay? This is what I think in my world would actually happen as the season wears on, at least until somebody gets injured, okay? This right here, this top line, this is the primary defense, or the base defense if you want to call it. So 1st and 10, 2nd and 5, 3rd and 5, those kinds of defenses, those kinds of downs and distances. That's where, 70% of the time, 75% of the time, that's about where defenses play the most often. So this is the primary defense. We'll get to that in just a second. The second line here is the short distance second and 2, 3rd and 1, goal line, those kinds of defenses. We'll get to that in a second, but that's what that line's about. And then right here, these are the long distances, okay? So this would be 3rd and 10, 2nd and 15, 1st and 20, those kinds of downs. This would be the players that I would put in right here, okay? So let's walk our way through it. I'm going to start with this, though, and I think this is the most important thing right here, Chris Jones. I always think you have a building block, and you build off of that. And to me, Chris Jones is the building block, okay? Chris Jones plays defensive tackle. That's his natural position. And he's solid against the run, but he is best at getting pressure on the quarterback. And so I really want Chris Jones in my base defense 70 to 80% of the time, and I want him there at defensive tackle. Now here's why. This has been the big discussion all offseason. And again, I'm not trying to predict what Andy Reid will do, and I'm not even trying to tell the Kansas City Chiefs what to do. This is just what I would do. I don't like the idea of moving Chris Jones to defensive end any more than about 25, 30% of the time. We'll talk about him at defensive end here in just a second. But I want to talk about first why I think he should be a defensive tackle for 70 or 80% of the entire season, and why I would leave him there, and why I think it's so important to leave him there. And the first reason is, for defensive tackle, is that is his natural position. I don't want to say I cringe a little bit, I always hesitate to take my best player and move them out of their best position. Now, teams have done that in every sport, and sometimes it's just necessary, and I understand that. I totally understand the thinking. I don't have any problem understanding that. And I think that Chris Jones would play very well at defensive end. I don't think he'd have any problem switching over to that big defensive end position, not the defensive end that's going to drop out in coverage or cover out in the flat, nothing like that. But that big defensive end position, I don't think he'd have any trouble transferring over there. That's really not the question. But the point is, his best position, his natural position, is defensive tackle. And I don't like asking my best player to move out to a different position unless I have no other choice. Now, teams have done it. It has worked in the past for some teams. For other teams, it has not. The question here, though, is I don't like doing that unless I just absolutely have to. Now, my second reason is more important, and that is that it puts him farther away from the quarterback. And this is just simple geometry. When he's not a defensive tackle and he's moved out a few yards out there to defensive end, he's farther from the quarterback. He's not a super fast defensive lineman. He's fast for defensive tackle, but for defensive end, he's not fast at all. And he's going to be using up a lot more energy at defensive end trying to chase quarterbacks around than he is a defensive tackle from a vertical position or almost vertical position than if you put him out there at defensive end. So I don't like it for that reason either. I don't like doing that a lot because it just takes him farther away from the quarterback, and he has more yardage to cover on every single play, and he's using up more energy on every single play, and he's not particularly fast for defensive end. So I think you're actually losing something there when you push him out to defensive end. Now, my last reason is this, and to me, this is by far and away the most important one. Even if you don't like the first two reasons, this last reason is the most important, and that is that it gives defenses the chance to not even block him at all. Instead of using a lot of resources to try to stop him at defensive tackle, when you push him out there at defensive end, they don't have to double team him anymore. In fact, if they want to, and this is going to sound crazy, but we're going to dive into this. If they want to, they don't even have to block Chris Jones at all when he moves out to defensive end. Now, this is wacko, but we watched Kansas City do this to Houston in week 2, I think it was, week 1 or week 2, maybe it was week 1, in 2020, just this past season with J.J. Watt. I think it was J.J. Watt, yep. They're all-world defensive end. We watched Kansas City for probably most of the first 3 quarters basically not use anybody to block Watt at all. I mean, for the first 3 quarters of that game until the score was out of reach and Houston really didn't have a chance of winning that game at all. Now this is wacky, but here's what Kansas City did, and it was a really, I don't know who came up with that, if that was Andy Reid, or if that was Eric Bieniemy, or if that was somebody else, or if this is something they watched some other team do in 2019 to the Houston Texans. There were many, many plays where they simply ran the ball away from Watt. Watt would be on one defensive end position. They would simply run the ball away from him and not even block him at all. They would basically pull his defenders straight off to block, and he would end up chasing the play, using up energy basically, and never even get there because he's such a big guy. On a lot of plays, they would simply roll Patrick Mahomes out to one side of the field. The wide receivers and the tight ends all know to come to that side of the field. Of course, they're running routes to that side. And they spent a part of the game just running completely away from Watt. And Watt was almost, I don't want to say it was a non-factor because he's influencing the game plan, but Watt was not able to have any major impact. He wasn't able to make tackles. He wasn't able to get sacks. He wasn't able to explode on the running game because they simply just ran away from him and, in fact, didn't use any resources to block him at all. And Watt spent most of the first 3 quarters using up a lot of energy and really having very little to show for it on the stat line. Now, you could say, well, he had a major impact because he limited Kansas City to one half of the field, and he limited Kansas City to running football. True, but at that point, Kansas City has numbers when they're blocking to that side of the field as well. So they basically negated Watt last year against the Houston Texans. And teams can, if they want to, do the exact same thing to Chris Jones if he's lined up at defensive end. Now, not every team is going to do that on every play or on every week, but teams can do that. It's an option for them. It gives them a choice of how to attack Chris Jones, and it takes control away from the Chiefs and Chris Jones. Now, when Chris Jones lines up at defensive tackle, where I would like to leave him, teams can't do that. They have to use resources, and in fact, they have to use 2 blockers on most plays, unless they have an exceptional, and I mean an exceptional, interior guard or center, and usually has to be the guard. Unless they've got an exceptional guard, an all-pro kind of a guard, they've got to use 2 blockers on Chris Jones. And me personally, I don't want to slide Chris Jones out there to defensive end where teams have the option of not even blocking him at all and just running away from him, when instead I can keep him at defensive tackle and get that push here. And where I really, really start to salivate is when I have Jarran Reed right there beside him. Okay, now this is important. Talked about this before with Jarran Reed. Jarran Reed usually is not the first person to get to the quarterback. He's just not that fast, and his moves aren't quite that good. But he is very big, and he is very strong. And his push is so, I don't know how else to describe it except a tottering wall, one of those ancient walls of ancient cities when an army would just beat and beat and beat and beat on a wall until it pushed in. That's kind of how Jarran Reed is. He's kind of like a battering ram. His moves aren't great. He's not as athletic as Chris Jones, and he's not as fast as Chris Jones, but he just hammers and hammers and hammers. And when you put Jarran Reed at one defensive tackle and Chris Jones at the other defensive tackle, they can't double and triple team both of these guys, okay? Opposing teams are going to have an absolute nightmare guarding these 2 defensive tackles, because even though Jarran Reed is rarely the first guy to get to the quarterback, it's not unusual for him to be the second guy. If you have Reed and Jones pushing up the middle, it's going to get a lot of quarterbacks off of their comfort spot that they like to throw from for most of the NFL season. And I personally wouldn't want to get away from that. Now the talk has been, and you never know, sometimes people are just blowing smoke and maybe it's just talk. The talk has been that since we've got Reed at defensive tackle, we can afford to kick Jones out to defensive end. And I just see it completely the opposite. I cannot resist having Jones at one defensive tackle and Reed at the other defensive tackle, realizing that teams are going to have to make a choice between who to double team. Excuse me. That would be absolutely irresistible to me, to leave both of those guys at defensive tackle, not on every play, but for about 600 plays for Reed for the primary defense, and about 600 to 700 plays for Chris Jones at the primary defense. at defensive tackle. For me, that would be absolutely irresistible. I have been salivating over that for months now, until I heard about them trying to push Chris Jones out to defensive end. Okay, so that's just me. That's the way I see it. I think Jones is so much more valuable. Teams have to double team Chris Jones. They can't not double team Chris Jones unless they have an all-pro kind of an interior guard to block him. And even then, most of the time, they're not going to be able to double team Jaron Reed. And Reed is going to have these one-on-one matchups, and he's going to win a lot more of those than he did in Seattle, because he got double teamed a lot in Seattle. Okay, so I really think keeping both these guys here at defensive tackle, not on every play, but on the lion's share of the primary defense, the base defense plays, I think that's the thing to do. I just absolutely cannot see pushing Jones out to defensive end. Now, before I'm going to come back to this line here in a second. We'll talk about the primary defense, but I want to keep talking about Chris Jones. I'm not opposed to, and in fact, I like the idea of dropping Chris Jones to defensive end on the short yardage plays and even on the long distance plays, okay, for about 100 snaps each. All right, and they've got about 180, 200 kinds of those snaps each year. I would like to drop Chris Jones down there. And here's why. When you get to short yardage plays, this line right here, Kansas City has 4 guys who are very large, and together I think would be quite a wall against teams trying to run the football. And Kansas City, keep this in mind too, Kansas City, even though they've improved in the NFL against stopping the run, they haven't gotten a lot better at it. In fact, they're not even average at stopping the run. The playbook for beating Kansas City over the past couple of seasons hasn't changed from what it did 3 or 4 seasons ago, and that is, if you can run the football on them, they're a little soft up the middle and around the edges. You can run the football on them, keep the ball away from Patrick Mahomes. Now, when you get into short yardage stuff, or anytime, when you're playing Baltimore, who wants to run the football all the time anyway, you can kick Chris Jones out here to defensive end, and I think he'll hold up pretty well there at defensive end. He's a big guy, and I think he'll stand up very well versus having a small guy out there, for instance, like a Frank Clark. Same thing with Jaron Reed. Reed has played a lot of defensive end in Seattle. He's nowhere near as good at getting to the quarterback from the defensive end spot. We talked about that in the previous video, but he holds up very well against the run at the defensive end position. So for me personally, when you get to short yardage, this is a little weird, it's just the way it sets up this year for Kansas City. I would take Reed and Jones and kick them out to defensive end on those running plays, those short yardage plays. And then I bring in this guy, Derek Nottie, who has gotten better and better and better against the run, and to where he's a major disruptor, and he just fits in right perfectly here at defensive tackle on any kind of running play at all. I think he's their best run stopper on defense now. Jones isn't bad. Reed is pretty good. Not is the best, I think. And if he holds up right there, continues to hold up, that's the guy to put in on any short yardage play of any kind if you think that a team's going to run the football on you, or on weeks in which you're playing teams who like to run the football a lot. Okay, Mottie's the guy to put in there. And then Saunders is a guy who, I'm really just plugging him in there for size. I don't know that he's necessarily a dominant run stopper. In fact, we haven't seen that he is, but he's just so big. I would love to at least try at the start of the season, maybe take a look at this through the training camp, try Saunders there at defensive tackle on the short yardage plays. And you have 4 guys here who I think the lightest, I think maybe Chris Jones right here at like 285 pounds, 290, 295 pounds, right in that 10-pound range. That's the lightest. And then you get all the way up here, I think, to Saunders, who's up there, I forget exactly, 320 pounds, 330 pounds. You got some big guys here in the middle and big guys here at defensive end. That's quite a pile of weight to try to move if you're other NFL teams. And other NFL teams are doing this with their defensive lines on short yardage. They're putting in these big hosses here. So this, to me, would make a lot of sense. And Chris Jones here could eat up about 100 snaps, which, by the way, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for ways to get some of these top 5 guys here out the defensive end This is one of those ways in which I like it. Reed comes out here and eats up about 180 more snaps there at defensive end. You keep a good player on the field. You don't put in players that maybe aren't quite as good. I also like putting Jones out here at defensive end on long yardage plays, and for this reason. Reed can create pressure in the middle. Wharton, we saw it last year. Wharton's a guy I really like. Matter of fact, I like Wharton so much, but he's a very light kind of a guy. I think he runs 6'5", maybe 260 pounds. He's pretty thin for defensive tackle, and I would really like to see him move out to defensive end. In this rotation right here, I would personally like to see him eat up a lot of snaps at defensive end. Now, I don't get to see him up close. Maybe Kansas City's already thought about that. Maybe they've already looked at him at defensive end. I haven't heard anybody even mention the slightest whisper about moving Wharton out to defensive end. To me, it just makes a ton of sense when you understand his size, and it's somewhere around 6'4", 6'5", 260-ish pounds, give or take 5, depending on where he starts the season at and where he ends up at. He's not a big guy in terms of defensive tackles, and I would really love to see him, even though I know defensive tackle is his main position. He's the guy I would like to see come out here on the primary defense and eat up a lot of these snaps at defensive end. Now, again, I say that having not seen him at defensive end, and maybe Kansas City's already thought about that, and it already doesn't look like it's going to work. So, I'm going to hold back a little bit there, but that would be my desire anyway. But on long yardage plays, Chris Jones kicks out the defensive end. Wharton's going to be fine at defensive tackle on those long yardage plays. He can just pin his ears back. He's done very well at getting the quarterback. Reed can create pressure there. And in fact, Reed and Wharton or Reed and Clark, either one, can run a great two-man game. This is really where Clark plays his best, when he can just pin his ears back and just go after the quarterback. And this really would be where this would be a very effective defensive line here in getting to the quarterback on 3rd and 10, on 2nd and 15, on 1st and 20. These guys right here can create a lot of problems. Chris Jones can beat just about anybody at the tackle spots. Wharton can beat a lot of people there just with his quickness at the defensive tackle position. Reed creates the pressure, demands the double team. But if Reed wants to play a two-man game and twist with Wharton and create a wall for Wharton, and Wharton comes in to play the quarterback, or if Reed wants to push this way and Clark comes in on a twist or a stomp, whichever way you want to call it, there's a lot of options there on those long yardage plays for Kansas City to do that. This sets up right here. Short yardage plays, huge guys here across the board who have shown that they are good against the run. And these guys here, this set of 4 right here on the long yardage plays really sets up well in getting pressure on the quarterback. All guys have shown that they can either do it or can run a two-man game. Frank Clark is at his best. He is never any better than when it's long yardage and when he gets to run a twist or a stunt with another big defensive lineman. That's where he was at his absolute best in Seattle, and that's where he'll be at his best here in Kansas City. Okay, so that is really what I would love to see. And again, first injury is going to change all of this. Second, third injury will change all of this. Somebody not playing very well will change this. The matchups will change from week to week. This is just an outline here. You go back to the primary defense, and we're almost done. I want to appreciate you watching today. Primary defense, I'll leave Frank Clark in there for 600 snaps. At the other defensive end position, it's a rotation. I've already said I'd love to see Wharton fill up a lot of those snaps. Maybe he can, maybe he can't. If he can't, though, and this is the final question. This is the question that I think bothers a lot of Kansas City people right now. How good is Kansas City at defensive end if they don't sign anybody else? And they're actually, I think, in pretty solid shape. They're not great, but they're in good enough shape to where I think if you kick Jones out there for about 200 snaps to defensive end, if you kick Reed out there for about 200 snaps to defensive end, if you do that, that leaves Okafor, who's not a great starter, but he's not horrible either. You're not going to be bleeding and hurting and suffering at defensive end. He's not going to do anything spectacular. He's going to be out there working. He'll be out there making some plays. He's halfway decent at defensive end. It also leaves you with Carlton, who's kind of like Wharton, tall, skinny, athletic kind of a guy. Carlton's a good guy when you need somebody to flare out, cover a running back, or when you need somebody to kind of pin in a fast quarterback. Carlton's a good guy for that. Kando's a project. He's another guy, tall, kind of a skinny defensive end, athletic, very much a project, has the talent. Can he actually perform? Can he stay healthy? We don't know, but Kando's there. Michael Dana's more of your hard-working, solid, balanced, efficient kind of a guy. He got, I think, 400 snaps last year. There's really no reason why he couldn't do that again this year. Again, none of these guys, Okafor, Carlton, Kando, Dana, none of these guys are going to impress. They're not going to make a lot of huge plays. They're not going to win any Pro Bowls. But I think with that combination, if the Chiefs are smart about kicking Jones out on certain kinds of plays, about kicking Reed out on certain kinds of plays, kind of stealing away from those defensive end snaps, if Clark is at least effective like he can be, when you take these other four guys, I think you're fine at defensive end. You're not great. If you start getting some injuries, like you did at offensive line last year, if you start getting some injuries to some of these top defensive tackles, you may start to hurt at defensive end because there won't be anybody to kick out the defensive end anymore. But I think you're okay for now. All right, as you head through the season, I think you can take a couple of injuries and still be fine at defensive end. And we'll see what happens with Clark in October, but I think he's going to be able to play the season based on what I'm hearing and listening from people who know more about it than I do, more about the legal system. I think you're okay at defensive end. We'll end with this, and this is the reason why I don't think they should go out and get a big name at defensive end. It's going to cost you a lot of money. The Chiefs are they have already spent, through restructuring, they have already spent more money off of 2022 season, the 23 season, the 24 season, just to keep a team together this year that can make a run at the Super Bowl. If they go out and get a guy who's going to cost them $6, $7, $8 million, they're going to have to restructure somebody, and that means they are borrowing another $6 or $8 million from 2022 and from 2023. Is it going to kill those seasons? It's not going to kill those seasons, but it is going to hurt. It's going to take away a little bit from your financial flexibility in those seasons. And I know, I say this all the time, you're going to want to win a Super Bowl just as much in 2022 and 2023 as you do this year in 2021. So financially, it's really not there. It's really not a good option, and I think Kansas City should stay away from that. Now, there's a few guys out there who are coming back from injuries. I think if Kansas City wants to, if they want to get a little bit better depth at defensive end, there are some veterans out there, about 15 to 20 guys, who you could probably get for about $1 million to $1.5 million. Will not hurt the salary cap. They come in, maybe they pitch in about 400 to 600 snaps at defensive end. Maybe they play from October on or November on or just whenever you need them to. There are some guys out there who, as they recover from injuries, would be effective players at defensive end. So that wouldn't surprise me if Kansas City doesn't do that at some point moving forward. I may or may not do a video about that. I've got the list ready. I'm still looking up injuries of some of these guys. But financially, it's not a good idea for Kansas City at all to be going out there and getting one of the last few remaining top-end defensive ends. If they're going to cost you $6, $7, $8 million this season, it's just not a good idea. It's going to hurt 2022 and 2023 financially. That money will not take care of itself. That means it's already gone, it's already been spent, and you can't get it back. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go through here. All right, thank you so much for listening. I think that's it. We have rolled all over this place. We'll see you next time. Have a great one. Goodbye.